Now, Matt's going to be continuing our sermon series today on the Sermon on the Mount, just continuing on from where we left it off last week. And I would like to invite Kate up now to go through the two Bible verses for today's sermon.
So Matthew, first of all, chapter 5, 27 to 30. You have heard that it was said, you should not commit adultery. But I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with a lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better to lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. And Romans chapter 8, verse 13. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live.
Well, morning all, and again, welcome to our Sunday morning service. Great to have you here with us. Just in case we haven't met, my name is Matt, and I'm continuing our sermon series on the Sermon on the Mount that we started originally last year, picked up again this year. And this morning we're looking at that relatively famous but also very challenging passage that was read out beforehand, all about lust, adultery, plucking out eyes and chopping off hands. Pretty heady stuff. From the get-go, it's probably worth just kind of pointing out that a big idea that comes through this, I was trying to kind of, I suppose, summarise what some of the big ideas in these couple of verses are. A big idea, at least in my reading, is that it's highlighting the gap, such a common gap between how often us, present to you and to other people, and what's actually going on in our interior lives, if you like. What's going on behind the scenes. There's often a huge gap between that. And in this passage, that gap is being demonstrated in the context of relationships, of really intimate relationships. And Jesus, by extension, he's calling those who follow him to close that gap between the often holy and righteous presentation, what we kind of give to the world, and what's actually going on inside, the less than righteous, often messed up heart condition. And that gap, again, in these couple of passages, it's kind of being highlighted or exemplified in the relationships between men and women. And this gap, funnily enough, like most things in life, I suppose, it can be kind of summed up in a song. So last night, as it just turned out, this is complete providence, we had Mick Adams, who some of you guys will know, came around to join us for some food and drinks. And myself, trying to be a good host with Louis, one of the things I try to do when people come around is I put on some music in the background that they like. Like that is assuming it's good music. If it's not good music, if they haven't got good taste, then I see it as an opportunity to give them like a free education. So I'll play something that I know they should like and learn to like. And Mick, as many of you guys know, he's a Bruce Springsteen fan from way back. So I found a Springsteen album that I wasn't really familiar with, wanted to get into. It was a perfect opportunity. And that's from the 1980s. It was called The Tunnel of Love. And there's a pretty famous song from that I just wasn't familiar with. But it was written, and this is meant to be a fairly confessional album. And it turned out that after it came out, he and his wife at the time broke up. And so a lot of the songs in this album reflect that really tumultuous, dicey time, complicated time in their relationship. And so this song, I'll just read you a quick verse. It sums up, I think, like a lot of this sermon brilliantly. So Springsteen writes, and he addresses, his partner. He says, "Now you play the loving woman, I'll play the faithful man. But just don't look too close into the palm of my hand. We stood at the altar. The gypsy swore our future was right. But come the wee hours, well, maybe, baby, the gypsy lied. So when you look at me, you better look hard and look twice. Is that me, baby, or just a brilliant disguise?" Just a brilliant disguise. This talk is all about getting rid of that brilliant disguise that so many of us can put on. And that's not just in the context of intimate relationships. This talk is certainly not just about exclusively intimate physical relationships. It's about all our relationships, our proclivity to put on that brilliant disguise, this huge gap between how we present to the world and to each other. I've got it all together, I'm perfect, I'm righteous, and what's really going on inside in our hearts, that brilliant disguise. Okay, so the big picture. Jesus has said just a little bit earlier in verse 17 of chapter 5, remember, he hasn't come to abolish, that is, get rid of the Old Testament law, but to fulfill it. In other words, to bring it to its kind of rightful apex or conclusion. And in the following 6 sections after that intro, he offers some examples of what that fulfillment is going to look like. And the results, if you like, they kind of constitute a moral compass for living in God's kingdom. And it's not going to be easy, but it will be fulfilling. So here's what the great theologian and churchman John Calvin said in relation to this. Great, thanks, mate. Jesus means that however difficult, arduous, troublesome or painful God's rule may be, we must make no excuse for that, as the righteousness of God should be worth more to us than all the other things which are chiefly dear and precious. So this is just naming up that living in accordance with this compass is likely going to be difficult for all of us, in different ways as well. But at the same time, we should add that it's both what we're commanded to do, particularly here in the Sermon on the Mount, and it's also, I'd argue, what we were designed for as well. And so the overall benefit will be massive, but it's still good to set expectations that this is going to be hard. Now, let me show you where we're hoping to head this morning. Thank you. So here's our roadmap. So we're going to start off by looking at what is meant by looking at someone lustfully. And also with that, the significance of adultery. Why is it such a big and serious deal? And then we're going to examine what Jesus is saying about the nature of sin in this passage. And lastly, we'll think about some practical implications in relation for us here and now, particularly in relation to what does cutting off hands and plucking out eyes possibly mean for us here in 2021. But before we get much further into that, it's worth reminding ourselves from the get-go that Jesus, Scripture, and mainstream historical Christianity, I would argue, are not prudish. We shouldn't have a history or a reputation as being anti-sex, anti-erotic, or even anti-desire. This is like one of the first images that popped up when I just searched for prudish Christians or something like that. I should say I've met some nuns in my time, worked alongside some nuns in my time, and they are the least prudish people I've ever met. So down to earth, the salt of the earth, couldn't shock them with anything, and did fantastic jobs. So this just highlights it's such an unfair, I think, reputation. In addition to all those things, the desire, the erotic desire, all that stuff, in addition to that being part of how we're designed by God, we only need to turn to the Song of Solomon, the Old Testament, to see a celebration of sexual desire in the right context. So we need to get rid of these stereotypes that can still hang around of Christianity being sexually repressed or only interested in sex for the sake of procreation. If anything, I think it could be argued that we should have a richer and deeper and subsequently more, I suppose, enjoyable take on desire. Because we don't uncouple desire, we don't detach it from love. We know and believe that sexuality, erotic desire, is an expression of something greater. And that is the need all of us have as created beings for intimacy. The God-created desire to both know and be known by others, and ultimately to know and be known by God. But then that begs the question, maybe you don't believe that. Fair enough. So if you don't, it begs the question, is taking that erotic desire outside an intimate relationship, is that really such a bad thing at all? Like what harm does it do? And I'd say it's worth reflecting on your experience, your own experience and that of others, in order to answer that question. I personally haven't met anyone yet who's said, I've got some kind of issue with pornography, and I'm completely okay with it. I think that's fine. I think it's okay to again detach erotic desire from the context of intimate relationships. I still haven't met that person. I think if you look, and I can only speak, from a guy's experience, but looking out on what's going on in the world now, a movement that you may have heard of called men going their own way, where more and more men are giving up on intimate relationships and giving up on marriage, giving up on being fathers, and just kind of going for short, fleeting, romantic sexual relationships. No one who I've come across outside that movement thinks that's a good thing, that's a great thing. The kind of pick-up artistry culture that was developing online, again, very similar, where guys were just skilling up in terms of how to have short-term fleeting relationships with women. That was big a couple of years ago. No one outside of that sphere thought that was a great thing. And again, just think of your own experience. Most of us, by the time we hit a particular age, we've either hurt someone in the terms of relationships where desire has been uncoupled from intimacy and love, or we have been hurt in that context. It's all too common. So I think just to say, well, it's not a big deal, what's the big deal with this? I think that is naive, and I think that's worth considering. Okay, let's move on to that first point. What does everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart? What does that mean? You shall not commit adultery was the seventh commandment out of the famous 10, as per Exodus 20:17. And there's Charlton Heston doing his thing. Classic pose. What's the big deal with adultery? With getting involved sexually with someone who you're not in a relationship with? Now, lots could be said here, but just taking it back to the biggest picture. Adultery is the most common metaphor that the Old Testament uses to describe the unfaithfulness of God's people towards him. So adultery is the kind of code word for when people stray and begin worshipping other gods, either instead of the God of Israel or even alongside the God of Israel. God is a God who has always entered into covenants with people. And by covenants, we're talking about reciprocal, exclusive, faithful relationships, where it's said that he will be their God and they will be his people. And the New Testament, as you're probably aware, uses the metaphor of marriage in this context. So the church is the bride of Christ. And this kind of exclusive, faithful, covenant relationship is woven into us, I'd suggest, as God's creatures. It's part of what it means to be made in his image. And it's reflected in marriages. It's also reflected to some degree in close platonic relationships. Because again, it's not as if erotic desire is the apex. It's the desire for intimacy, to be known and to know someone in I suppose, complete transparency and vulnerability. That's what it's supposed to be kind of getting to. And in most cases, we don't respond well to faithlessness in relationships. Again, whether that's romantic or close platonic friends or family. We don't do well in the face of betrayal, of breaches of trust. Our response to that, I think, when we suffered a breach of trust, it's on a human level, it's a small reflection of God's response to it on a divine level. Adultery, or a significant betrayal of trust in close relationship, it brings profound pain with it, and a whole host of other emotions. Now, it seems that at the time of Christ, here in the Sermon on the Mount, that the scribes and the Pharisees, so the religious authorities of the day, they were teaching that adultery was just doing the physical act. So as long as no deeds were being done, they could say that the seventh commandment was being observed perfectly and that they were being righteous. But what's really interesting here is that Jesus is interested in not just someone's observable actions. He's concerned with their motives, with their interior lives, with what's going on in their hearts. So you'll remember in Luke 16:15, he said to the Pharisees, "You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts." So God, Jesus, he's not just interested in just the doing of the right thing or the not doing of the wrong thing. He's interested in what's going on inside someone as well. He's concerned about their imagination, their thoughts, their aspirations, their motives, their desires. The stuff that on a good day, I can hide from you if I want to, in a brilliant disguise, so to speak. That's what he's interested in as well. So he makes his definition of adultery here encapsulate everyone who looks at a woman or a person with lustful intent. So it's no longer just the act itself. It's the desire, it's the motive, it's the longing. And it should be said, looking with lustful intent isn't the same thing as stock, standard, instantaneous attraction. It's not, for example, and you'll have to excuse me, this is going to reflect a Gen X sensibility. It's not recognising that Angelina Jolie is beautiful or that Brad Pitt is handsome. Or, I mean, just take your own example so that it works, you know, that Alistair Richardson is really handsome, for example. Hopefully he'll watch this online. And being kind of like attracted naturally to to that kind of beauty when you see it embodied in someone else. It's not that. Looking with lustful intent is more about leering or staring, albeit secretly. It's at least a few bases on from the almost instinctual, oh, you're beautiful kind of response or appreciation. And it's also really important to see that Jesus, he's not adding anything to the Old Testament definition of adultery here. In fact, he's drawing our attention back to that lustful thoughts and feelings, not just actions. These have always counted. They've always mattered. So whilst you shall not commit adultery was commandment number 7, you shall not covet. That is, have a strong or a moderate desire for something or someone that doesn't belong to you, that belongs to someone else. You shall not covet was commandment number 10 as well. And a specific example of coveting that we read in the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20 was you shall not covet your neighbour's wife. You should not covet your neighbour's wife. So it's right there. You shall not fantasize, pine, dream, lust after, all in your heart and your head, someone who is in a relationship with someone else. Regardless of whether you carry it out via actions or not, you should not even think about that, consider that, plot that, dream about that. And that was right back in Exodus. So again, Jesus isn't adding something new to the original definition of what constitutes adultery. He's drawing our attention and reminding us of what it always involved right from the start. So that's the first point, lust and adultery. But now look at Jesus' response to the likely possibility of us being tempted to sin. And this is the second point. Why the right eye and the right hand specifically? Why cut them off? Why pluck them out? So at the time, the right eye, believe it or not, and the right hand were seen as being dominant and more important than their left-handed counterparts. And I'll leave it to your imagination to guess why particularly the right hand was given so much prominence and the left-handed one was kind of left behind. Jesus seems to be saying that if the most important and precious things in your life are leading you to persistent sin, so not so much as one-off sin, but kind of persistent sin, persistent self-destructiveness, persistent rebellion, disobeying God's will, going against your design pattern, then if so, they are putting your eternal fate at risk. And if that's the case, get rid of them. Just get rid of them. Do whatever it takes to get rid of them. Now, it may be valuable to you, whatever that thing is, like the right eye, the right hand, the equivalent. It may be good in and of itself. But if it proves to consistently lead you to have the wrong thoughts, attitudes, desires, or actions, then it has to go. You need to get rid of it. And why is that? Why the need to get rid of it? Again, not because those things are bad per se, but because of what's at risk. And what's at risk, Jesus seems to be saying, is your very being, your very essential, eternal being. And this, of course, also highlights just how terribly corruptive sin is. There's nothing wrong with right hands and eyes. And I say that as a left-handed person myself. Like, there's no shame in being right-handed. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. God made them. But sin can pervert their very use. Desire, again, in the right context, is beautiful and fitting. But sin can take that and corrupt that into lust. And notice how Jesus here, he's left talking about lust specifically. Lust is one of the sins. He's now moved on to talking and addressing sin more generally. So Lloyd Jones, again like the great Welsh preacher and theologian, writing on this, he reflects on how we as Jesus' followers should be following Jesus in this model. That is, we should be less concerned with individual sins, which we can so easily contrast with other people's, which we can compare to other people's, which we can take those individual sins and map out a kind of moral hierarchy, you know what I mean? Which, of course, in those hierarchies, they always end up with your sins normally being worse than mine. So I might have an issue with money and materialism, but that's so much better than you, who's got an issue with drinking and beating up on their wife. You're so much worse than me. Instead, Jones says we need to be more aware of sin itself, big picture, as a condition that we suffer. So he writes, sins are nothing but the symptoms of a disease called sin. Symptoms can vary tremendously. It is not the symptoms that finally count, but the disease. Sin is a disease. And it's a powerful disease because it's internal and we are riddled with it, if you like. And that makes sense as it stems from our very hearts. So remember these words again from Jesus in Matthew chapter 15, 18 to 19. The things that come out of the mouth come from the heart, and these things defile a man, a person. For out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, and slander. It's not the hands. It's not the eyes. It's the stuff that starts here. Come evil thoughts. Again, it's not just what we do that counts. It's what goes on inside. Our thoughts, again, are mentioned here. So I can so easily congratulate myself because I didn't do the obvious bad thing. You know, we bite our tongues and stop ourselves from verbally abusing that family member. Great. We choose not to take the top off the bottle or the can. Fantastic. We shut down the web browser and we don't look at the page. Good on us. That's good. They're all good things. And that's certainly better than following through with any of those actions. But sin is more insidious and stealthy than that. We can feel all too comfortable and happy with ourselves at that point of not actually doing, instead of perhaps asking the more pertinent question of, why did I want to do all those things in the first place? Where did those initial desires and perhaps secret wants come from? That's the heart of the issue. That's the all-pervasiveness of sin. That's how deeply ingrained it is. It can delude us into thinking that it's not that much of a big deal. But again, just look back at this passage and see how seriously Christ takes it. If a good, valuable and precious thing in your life is leading you to consistently sin, then get rid of it. It's not worth the cost. Jesus knows, as Paul writes later in Romans, that the wages of sin is death. Death. Sin is ultimately destructive. And that's whether the symptom itself is lust, anger, greed, or pride. And what's at stake, again, is our ultimate destiny. And that's why Lloyd Jones can say, and again, just consider this, don't dismiss this offhand. He wrote, the most important thing in this life is to prepare ourselves for eternity. The most important thing in this life is to prepare ourselves for eternity. Note, not the only thing in this life, not the only good thing, not at all, but the most important. The most important. Third and lastly, some potential implications for us. So researching for this sermon, some of the commentators I read talked about the old school Puritans, a sub-branch of Christianity going back a while now, I suppose. And some of their critics considered them morbid, really morbid. And one of the reasons they considered them morbid is because the Puritans, they took self-examination of their particular sins very seriously, too seriously in the eyes of their critics. They were students of sin, if you like. And of course, this could be taken way too far. It can become obsessive. It can just lead to a whole lot of guilt and shame. But if we believe that sin is embedded in our inner being, in our hearts, and if we believe that it's so insidious, then no good is going to come from denying it or ignoring it. We're better off confronting it. Know your enemy, as Sun Tzu, I believe, wrote, and Rage Against the Machine later sang. And as Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 5, he wrote, sorry, can we go back one, Andrew? Here we go. Examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. Examine yourselves. If we want to stay humble, if we want to be self-aware, if we want to stop our sin from bubbling up and eventually revealing itself over here in some particularly harmful and unintended ways, we need to be familiar with it. And this is going to be confronting, I know. There's lots of kind of classic sermon examples that you can go to kind of point this out. And someone reminded me of this one just the other day. Just imagine, and this has been, I think I heard this when I was probably 7, but just imagine how you'd feel if your thought life, so the content of your daydreaming, your most private domains, how you'd feel if you know your fantasy life, your daydreams, your thoughts, your secret aspirations, if they were broadcast on some great big screen and all your loved ones, your family and friends were invited for a viewing. Can we go forward 2 slides, Adrian? Thanks, yeah. Imagine that. How comfortable would you be with that? What would make you cringe? At what point would you recoil? That may be a good indicator of where your particular and, if you like, regular sins are being made manifest. And look, I know this sounds morbid, but I'd argue it's actually strangely liberating. I was listening to this podcast recently with a Christian literature professor, and she kind of specialised in Dostoevsky, so the famous Russian author from the 1800s, and Flannery O'Connor, a not quite so famous American author in the early to mid 1900s. This is a picture of Flannery O'Connor here. Now, both these authors were people of faith, and both these authors were renowned in their fiction for characters and plots that involved depravity, blood, murder, betrayal, etc. But importantly, their plots weren't gratuitous. They were realistic, but it was enough to shock and put off some audiences, and still is. But get this, alongside that unvarnished, eyes wide open take on the sinful human condition, you have these other characters that populate their books. And these other characters are characters of grace, of forgiveness, of love. They're these little human scale models of Christ. And they shine all the more amongst the darkness. Like, do you see what I mean? It's like being naive and overly innocent about sin, it doesn't make us more holy or righteous. I think it just leaves us vulnerable and liable to religious arrogance and smugness. Instead, doing the work of actually confronting our shortcomings can send us running with open eyes and open arms into grace. He who has been forgiven much loves much. He who has been forgiven little loves little. The sick know that they need a doctor. They're both two paraphrases of some of the teachings of Christ, as you're probably aware. To get back to the earlier Sermon on the Mount, this is what it means partly to be poor in spirit, to be meek. It's to realise just how messed up we are, and subsequently how much we need Jesus and his grace and his power. And again, I know that lust to some degree has been the focus this morning, but this awareness and the need for self-examination, it's not just a young person's game. It's not meant to be like just a single person's game or anything like that. This is a lifelong endeavour. You may remember that I think Paul in 2 Timothy, which is I think usually recognised as the last book he wrote that's contained in the New Testament. So he's writing as at least a middle-aged, if not older man. And he can say then, I, Paul, am the chief of sinners. So even at that advanced age, he was fully aware of how much he needed Jesus because of his faults. So don't take this as being just directed at younger people or a particular class of people. This is for everyone. So awareness is the first step. And then fighting the sin that we discover is going to be the second. And this is a great example of us doing what we can to fight whilst being empowered by the Holy Spirit. So again, if you look at that passage from that verse from Romans that Kate read before, for if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. If by the Holy Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, that is, sinful deeds, you will live. So this verse tells me I've got some responsibility for this fight. I can't check out. I just can't let go and let God deal with it. I have to become aware of my sinfulness and then combat it. But crucially, alongside of this, I'm doing it with supernatural help, without which I'd fail. I'm fighting this with the Spirit, that is, with God's help and power. But I still have to fight. I still need to give it my all. I can't be fatalistic. I can't afford to be complacent. I have to strive. So Martin Luther, the great reformer, he put it like this. You have no call to pick up your feet and run away, but you need to stay put, to stand and battle against every kind of temptation, like a knight, and with patience, see it through and to triumph. So don't run away into denial or escapism or false righteousness. Stay put and battle, and with God's help, persevere. In terms of the specifics, what this fight may look like, it's going to depend on the individual, of course. Given that our passage is looking at lust specifically, a good blanket suggestion which came up in a heap of the commentaries is accountability. If lustful thoughts, fantasies, if coveting someone who you're not in a relationship with, if that's an issue for you, and let's be honest, it's an incredibly common issue these days, then find someone safe who you can confess this stuff to. Let them pray with you and for you. Let them help you, metaphorically, again, pluck that stuff out, drop that stuff off. And maybe that's going to involve internet blockers and changing some stuff in your environment. I don't know. But at least start by finding someone who you can confront that stuff with safely. Don't write this idea of confession and support off, just because it can sound so old-fashioned or confronting. But give it a go. Give it a go, if that's useful. Okay, that's almost it. Lastly, again, you may not be a Christian here this morning, or you may be on the fence, or you may just find this whole idea quite understandably morbid and odd. Fair enough. Let me finish with this. If you're completely happy with yourself, your conduct, your lifestyle, if you've got no regrets about how you behaved, if you're confident and comfortable about your thought life, your private desires, the content of your imagination and fantasies, if you don't think that you're capable of hurting other people, be that directly or by omission, basically, if you're happy with yourself as is, then this will understandably bounce right off you. But if you know that even your desires, your aspirations, your emotions are broken and compromised in some fundamental way, if you understandably feel any shame about how you behaved, or maybe are even behaving, or what's going on in your head, then this is an opportunity to consider another way. This admittedly really hard sounding teaching is actually liberating, I'd argue, because it says you can drop the pretense, you can quit the pretending and face up to your authentic, if you like, and true self. And remember, most importantly, that this hard teaching has come from someone who described themselves and lived in such a way as to be a good shepherd. A good shepherd. And that is the one who willingly leaves the 99 sheep who are already safe and contained in order to come after the one who is missing and lost, which may be you. And this is the one who knows you, who knows your true, both incredibly messed up, but at the same time beautiful self, and who died for you regardless of just being more familiar than we are with our own faults and deficiencies. So take some hope and some encouragement from that, please. Let me pray. Father, we thank you once again for the sermon. We thank you for sending your Son to both teach, but even perhaps more importantly, exemplify and embody everything that you ask us to do when it comes to following you. And Father, I pray that more and more we will, with the help of your Spirit, close the gap between, the public face that we put forward and what's going on internally, Father. Help us do the hard work, again with your assistance, of becoming self-aware. Help us unflinchingly just confront those areas of our lives that we'd understandably much prefer to ignore and to leave alone. And I thank you that you've placed us in a community where we can go down this path together, where we don't have to struggle alone, again, to kind of face up to where we fall short, Father. And I pray that if we need people in our lives right now here to help us more personally and specifically on this task, then you'll make them apparent, Father. Just show us who those people would be and point them out and give us the courage to approach them if that's what you'd have us do. Amen.